Our first speaker is Sheila Barry. Sheila is a range livestock and natural resource advisor working in the San Francisco Bay Area. And one of the important features that we need to think about when we're planning oak woodlands is the role that working landscapes and managed landscapes play in providing some of the habitat values that we heard about last week. So I'm going to turn it over to Sheila for about 25 minutes or so. Sheila, 30 minutes.
So I'm going to be discussing working landscapes, specifically of California's rangelands, which include, of course, oak woodlands, and are predominantly managed by livestock grazing. Topics that I'm going to cover include what is a working landscape? What are the benefits of a working landscape? Or put a different way, what are some of the ecosystem services that they provide? I'm going to mention the extent of working landscapes on both public and private land, and then talk a little bit in terms of thinking of planning. What are some of the challenges facing working landscapes, as well as what are some of the conservation tools and opportunities, also keeping in mind sort of the planner audience of what they might do to help sustain working landscapes. So what is a working landscape? Put simply, it's productive lands that are in harmony with a healthy environment. Productive meaning it's producing some sort of economic return, perhaps wind power, obviously livestock it could be one, but also could be oak harvesting, hunting, other agriculture, agritourism. More specifically, a working landscape is the management of soil, water, air, plants, animals, humans to produce food, feed, fiber, habitat, recreation, and open space in a way that is sustainable and beneficial to each. And because it is sustainable to each, it's also a way that we can really think about how we can manage our conservation lands, open space lands, sustainably. Of course, this all starts with the assumption that we really think that management does need to occur in our open spaces and our conservation lands. And I think there's growing recognition that many of our ecosystems, in order to provide the sort of values that we want, can't really just simply take care of themselves. And this is particularly evident if you think about California's annual grasslands and oak woodlands. You might be struck to ask, what was the historically occurred on our landscapes that now sort of require us to manage or maintain a working landscape so that these ecosystems persist? And in some respects, this question is somewhat irrelevant because we're really managing a very changed landscape, which is invaded by very aggressive annuals of Eurasian origin, like the Medusa head here on your right, that with or without without our management simply just do not go away, and we do not often get the ecosystem values that we're after. On top of that, despite our environmental regulations and even anti-litter campaigns, the sheer magnitude of our population and proximity of our land to open space and urban areas necessitates our management. So, what exactly are the benefits then, or ecosystem services that a working landscape can provide? Well, first, obviously, open space. And although you could argue that often our economic viability of a livestock operation relative to the golf course or that housing below is not quite on par, still there is an opportunity for there to be some economic return from this landscape. And for many, that's enough to want them to continue to own the landscape and manage it. Also, working landscapes provide for fire fuel management. And if we think about some of our earlier acquisitions of rangelands by public agencies, this was a real driver of why they continued to maintain ranching operations, was for fire fuels management. Working landscapes also then provide watershed protection, and this would be in terms of also both fire fuels management and also as a desirable land use. One of the fears of some water agencies is that their watersheds become more developed, and which would lead to greater potential loss of water quality. Also, working landscapes provide wildlife habitat, and often this habitat, like this brush pile here for quail, is man-made. California ranchers have a long history of habitat, both maintenance and creation, either for their own enjoyment in some cases, also for hunting, which might include things like stock pond development, which now has become important habitat, but also other things like brush piles. Working landscapes are also now provide critical endangered species habitat. And this is largely because of the need for some of our native species to have the non-native vegetation managed. This is an example of habitat for the bay checker spot butterfly, and preserves that were actually created for this butterfly in this San Mateo County. The butterfly's gone extinct from those preserves, and now in order to sort of facilitate the butterfly's return, they're doing mowing and herbicide, and instead in the southern part of Santa Clara County, the butterfly continues to persist under livestock grazing. Working landscapes then provide for actually a great amount of biodiversity and endangered species, and here's just a few of the species that have been shown to really benefit from both grazing and rancher stewardship, that being the golden eagle, the San Joaquin kit fox, western burrowing owl, and both the red-legged frog and tiger salamander, both species that are known to occur in livestock ponds. Working landscapes also provide for recreation, and although there's concern that in particular grazing and animals, large animals, are not compatible with recreation, I think we have a good example in the San Francisco Bay Area where it works quite well. We have over 2 million visitors to graze land a year in the East Bay, with very little conflict reported. And also, despite sort of, I think, concern that the public is not, has also concerns about what livestock grazing is doing to the land, I think there's a new sort of message that's getting out there, and people are really beginning to understand, one, the need for growing local food, but also the importance of grazing and maintaining our annual rangelands and woodlands. Working landscapes also then provide an ongoing steward. Management takes a person, and better yet, a person that's sometimes not on a time clock, who can be there Christmas Eve when there's some emergency that needs to occur. Some of the ranchers often remind me of this when there's been, cars through fences or some other event happen on a holiday, that they're there, 24/7, 365 days a year often to take care of their land. And working landscapes then provide food and fiber, and that's the economic driver that hopefully then adds sustainability to this picture of conservation. So what is the extent of California's working landscapes? Well, it's a bit hard to get an estimate of how widespread grazing is, but some estimates put that at least in and around the Central Valley, about a third of the state is managed as a working rangeland landscape. And this is really quite evident in areas like the San Francisco Bay Area, where not only is there a lot of private land that you see there in the green that is managed rangelands, but also a lot of the public land, which is in sort of the ivory color there on this map. There's also a lot of this public land that is managed with livestock grazing. And in fact, in the San Francisco Bay Area alone, there's at least 30 different public entities that use livestock grazing to manage their open space lands. And you can see here's a list that works from sort of the federal side. So we're not talking about what people traditionally think of public land, that being the BLM and Forest Service, but all these other entities which really have a variety of missions and reasons then that they use and want to see their landscapes managed, from water quality, watershed management, to endangered species like the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And then many of the cities which now have acquired land through mitigation for other developments within their city, or even public works projects. One of the studies we recently undertook was to try to get a handle on what sort of stewardship ranchers are providing on public land. So we interviewed 15 different ranchers, this was throughout the state, and had them sort of help us quantify the hours they spent doing non-production related things in their leases. We weren't able to find, as you'll see from this graph, much correlation between how they spent their time and either the size of the parcel, or in this case the animal unit months. It's quite variable between agencies that they're leasing from. But what we did find was that they spent a lot of time on their leases doing non-production related things. An average of 74% of their time was spent doing non-production related tasks, which you see a lot of them had to do with infrastructure. So this might have been roads, might have included also fencing, water development. Also another large category was in grazing management, which we included as being non-production because in many cases it was managing for specific goals of weeds or endangered species or habitat in general, or just improved rangeland, not necessarily driving better production. So in end, there's quite a large value that's being provided on our public lands by ranchers and how they spend their time. Now I want to move to some of the challenges that we have in keeping our landscape workings. And they all deal with sort of the three aspects here of sustainability: economic, social, and environmental. And first is clearly the cost of inputs. And just like we all are facing now higher fuel prices, so are our ranchers. And this is really something to think about in terms of planning, where we have many of our ranchers now who are using a number of both private and public leases to make their operations work, which means that they have to move animals from one place to another. So there's quite a bit of cost associated with that. Also, there is concerns about access to forage, which is leading, in some cases, conversion. This would be occurring, obviously, on private land. Conversion to other agricultural uses. We've seen a lot of this happen in the foothills around the eastern Central Valley, where rangelands are being converted into orchards, driven, of course, by better economic returns. But also there's this change in ownership that has led to a loss of access to forage, where it's gone from private to public ownership. And although, as we saw, a lot of public agencies continue grazing, many of them restrict the season of the grazing for some values. They also might even restrict the carrying capacity, or not the carrying capacity, but the stocking rates in order to achieve some conservation objectives. In some cases, this might make a lot of sense and be warranted, but often what's not asked is, what is the trade-off? What is the impact to production by shortening the season or reducing the stocking rate, and is there a way that goals can be met, conservation goals, and at the same time be able to maintain the economic viability of the operation. Another consideration is the loss of infrastructure, and this is another thing where we've seen this occur both in physical infrastructure, so that would be like water sources and fencing, and we've seen that on public lands where now where they've removed livestock for even a short time, and the infrastructure really starts to fall apart rather quickly, and there's a great cost to returning infrastructure. So there's an example of a park in Santa Clara County where they're very eager to restore livestock grazing for management of endangered species, and the cost of restoring just the physical infrastructure to graze about 500 acres is over $1 million. So that becomes quite cost prohibitive. But also there's a concern of loss of sort of the support infrastructure, so that would make the industry viable. So that would be the other pieces that grazing needs to be support, which might include things like feedlots, slaughterhouses, but even veterinarians, other sort of agricultural suppliers in the area. So having sort of an intact agricultural community around them is really important. Another economic consideration is the cost of regulation. And this isn't just about regulating sort of the production, but even in many cases, the range improvement practices that benefit both livestock and conservation. And this has also been equally frustrating to conservation-minded folks who want to see things like livestock ponds restored or maintained, and yet the cost of doing that is out of reach of a rancher. Next challenges to consider are similar but come from the social side, which is this access to forage, which more has to do with in thinking of concerns, for example, of conflict with public recreation and access, and how can we make those be compatible, and so that one rancher still have access to forage, and at the same time we provide people a safe recreation opportunity. And then also these regulations, which are obviously meant to seemingly protect the environment, but yet impede, in many cases, long-term conservation. The last category here is environmental, and that would obviously include things like climate change, which in the end might impact the viability of our ranchers. Obviously there's a lot of unknowns with climate change, but one thing seems to be certain that I think people don't think about is livestock access to water. And if we expect our climate to be drier or even have different patterns of rainfall, forage often becomes unavailable because there's just not water there for livestock to drink. So in addition to maybe some changes in forage that might result from climate change. And then weeds, which are both reduce carrying capacity for ranchers, but also have an environmental impact. So you begin to see that many of the challenges that ranchers face in keeping their landscapes working are the same challenges that are being faced in terms of conservation. And that is why in thinking of some of our tools and opportunities, these are many of the tools and opportunities that groups like the California Rangeland Conservation Coalition, a coalition of ranchers and environmental interest, academics, conservation interest, landowners, are all working together to address many of these constraints to the working landscapes, in the idea that this in the long term will help sustain both the working landscape and our conservation interest in the state. And so some of these opportunities include support of conservation easements. So this is funding for private landowners to continue their activities as ranchers, but give up their development rights. And sometimes that's a donated easement, sometimes that's a paid for easement. So those rights are bought outright for
from them. Another type of easement to consider is easements that would be also a type of conservation easements, but specifically to meet mitigation. In the past, there's been a sort of thought that the only way we can truly protect this land is to have it fee titled, acquired by a public entity. And if you recall, back on that list of landowners, there were lots of cities now that are owning rangeland. Well, as I mentioned, in many cases, they're owning it because they needed mitigation land. And so an alternative, and not always available, but might be that instead of them outright owning it, that they purchase an easement on a private ranch, which helps keep the landscapes more hopefully intact, the operations viable, and the long-term interest of all intact. Another sort of growing area of interest is payments for ecosystem services. Some of our water districts are considering this in terms of how we can keep, once again, ranchers or other interest on the landscape, keep water quality viable over the long term by supporting the continuation of current management through payments services. There's I guess not a lot of examples of this, particularly in California yet, but definitely a growing area of interest. And maybe in some cases it's not going to be outright payment, but maybe it comes even in terms of regulatory relief, that if you continue to do these sort of conservation practices, we give you some regulatory relief in another area. And that might be something for planners to think about, is where they have regulations that might be impacting a rancher in terms of some structure on their landscape. Is there an opportunity for them to have some regulatory relief in lieu of continuing doing what they've been their conservation practices. Additionally, support for industry infrastructure. So looking beyond just, we want this grazed landscape, or we want, to maintain these working landscapes, but sort of a recognition that takes some other infrastructure that may not be so desirable to us, like feedlots, like slaughterhouses, and particularly maybe some slaughterhouses that provide opportunity for our niche producers, who might do things like multiple species production. So definitely here there's a role for planners to consider how these pieces of infrastructure might fit on the landscape. Another area is thinking of terms of access on public lands. Although there's a lot of public land that is being managed by grazing, there's a lot of obstacles to some of it being grazed. And this is particularly true on much of our state lands. Our state parks has 1 million acres, some of it rangeland that could be grazed, some of it grazed, but there seems to be some barriers that are preventing access to ranchers in some areas where it might make a lot of sense. Another sort of growing interest area is this idea of grass banking. And this is a great year to think about grass banking because we have drought in much of the state. So if we're forcing our ranchers to sell livestock, sell their capital, it might be more sustainable if we can find alternative forage resources for them in places that currently aren't have available forage, we see this happening in some parts of the state now, where even on like state parks or fish and game grounds, where they're sort of recognizing maybe this is a time where we can start to find some opportunities for neighboring ranchers to keep them whole. And finally, conservation support funding. So working with ranchers so that they can control weeds, develop water, which both supports conservation outcomes as well as sustains ranching. That will sorry. That sort of ends my comments, and I'm not sure if we have time for questions.